Hello everyone, I'm Athira and I'm going to talk about the implementation of second order homogenization using shell elements for woven composites. And this work is supervised by ROC, Stephen Hallett and Bassam El Sayed. So I'm going to start by answering the question as to why we require a second order homogenization framework in the first place. So the problem statement arises from a need for higher order multi-scale modeling methods for materials like 3D woven composites, whose properties are highly dependent on the manufacturing process and also the internal architecture. So if we go back to the classical first order homogenization framework, we see that for every material point on the macro scale, the deformation tensor, the first order deformation tensor, is used to formulate the boundary value problem. And once the boundary value problem is solved, we get the macroscopic stress tensor, which is basically the RV stress field averaged over the RV volume. Now the problem with this first order framework is basically the assumption on which it is built, that is the principle of separation of scales, which requires that the RV scale has to be very small as compared to the macro scale. And this results, and because of this assumption, if we have something like a complex deformation mode or a higher order deformation mode in macro scale like bending, that would literally translate as a constant deformation gradient over the RV scale. And this problem is taken care of by a second order framework where we use both the deformation tensor and also its gradient to formulate the boundary value problem. And in the upscaling routine, when you're averaging this RV stress field, you get the higher order stress tensors as well. So in this in my work, I'm currently using a second order framework using shell elements, and this has been developed by Awais and Bassam. And this framework can accurately capture bending, membrane, and transverse shear components. So to study the implementation of this framework, I'm simulating some standard ASTM tests, starting with a 4-point bending test, wherein we see that the force displacement response for second order framework is very close to that we get from a high fidelity model for both a 2D and a 3D weave. And the first order responses vary significantly, which is what we expect. So if we focus just on a multilayer 2D weave, and if we compare cases for different offsets of multilayer weaves, starting from a 0 offset where we have the yarns basically aligning on top of each other, to a complete offset where we have a nested configuration, we see that the force displacement response for the nested configuration gives a better result as compared to that of a 0 offset. And this can be explained by the presence of matrix pockets in a 0 offset case which run through thickness. And these matrix pockets are disrupted when you have a complete nested configuration. So it enhances the overall stiffness of the structure. So the final test we did was a short beam shear test, wherein we wanted to induce a highly nonlinear stress distribution on the woven composites. And here we see that the second order framework deviates significantly from the high fidelity model for both the multilayer 2D and 3D weaves. And this can be explained by the use of shell elements in the macro scale, because shell elements by their nature cannot capture through thickness variation in stresses that you can actually see here in the high fidelity model. So this brings me to my current work, which is to actually develop a second order framework using solid elements in the macro scale, so that in the end we have a very generic framework which can capture all kinds of deformation modes. Also, the use of solid elements can be very computationally expensive, and that is why we would also try to explore the use of surrogate models, wherein we replace the fine scale analysis by an equivalent surrogate model so that the whole framework is computationally efficient. Yeah, thank you.